Today we're going to talk about I and the self. And that seems like a simple topic, but it's actually more complex than one would think. AI will impact what our concept of the self is, and it already has. And the self is a lot more complicated than we normally use it as a term in conversation. And many times we think of ourself as what we can see, where is that my hand, is that's part of me. And a lot of self is sometimes called consciousness, but it's our identity of what is me and what's not me. And that implies relative to something else besides the self. And self is, for those who are familiar with Zoolander, might be familiar with the hand model from Zoolander. And what is our hand? What is our self? Is that my hand, or is that a symbol of a hand, or the sort of how we perceive ourselves now? And our self is actually in part of a hierarchy that there's the self that we perceive, and then we're part of a family with friends and community on this planet and so forth. And it's part of a hierarchy that goes from the physical body out into the rest of where we are. And where this sense comes from is essentially ego, which is something that isn't really there at birth or death, is something that emerges as a way to distinguish our self and our agency from everything else. And it peaks around breeding time and emerges in early childhood, and then as you end of life, your sense of self deteriorates again. And there's other things that track that, whether the genes the genes in your body are 100% human genes at birth, but then you start to accumulate different kinds of organisms and DNA as you eat food and other things. And so when you are born, you're 100% human DNA, but by the time you're an adult, you're pretty much 99% microbes and other DNA from your food that is not necessarily your original DNA. That's there too, but it's much more complicated than that. And part of this is in the life cycle of sexual reproduction and learning to separate from your birth into replicating with others and so on. And this sense of self changes over time, both what you are and what you perceive about yourself. And there's a Greek character named Narcissus, who is famous for falling in love with his reflection of himself. And this is the root of what we call narcissists, which is people who are self-centered or obsessed with their self, and it interferes with their ability to interact with other people, where they're less connected to what the other people are as entities, that they are a reflection of their own self. And in modern times, with the invention of mirrors, that's been a different sense of ourself, as we define ourselves as what we look like in the mirror. And many species, when you give them a mirror, they don't recognize the reflection in the mirror as being themselves. But those that do, they interact with it, they touch it with their hand, or they move around and see how it reacts. But they're not really interacting with themselves, they're actually interacting with the reflection, which is a subset of who they are. And some creatures are confused by this, and they have reactions that are somewhat surprising. And so the self is part of a continuum of sort of the inside going to the outside that is extending beyond mirrors into essentially cameras and internet and the larger community as a whole. And so selfies are a new kind of mirror, which are an image of you or a video of you, of yourself, that is how you're perceived by other people, that you're in control of. But it's a new phenomenon where we used to get reflections of who we are based on the reactions of other people in real time, or animals or whatever. But now it's being extended across time. And so your selfie is more than just a one picture. It's actually your internet presence or your social media presence or your personal brand or your credit score or your report card. It's reflections of you coming from other points of view. And Jung tackled this concept of the self with the concept of the ego and the conscious self, where some of your image of yourself is conscious and some is unconscious or subconscious. And so he calls that your persona and ego that you're aware of, matched with your shadow self, which you're not aware of as much. And this can be extended beyond like yourself as a person, but yourself as a company, for example, that there's what you're aware of and in control of, and then there's the perceptions of other people that you may not be aware of and you may not be in control of. And Jung delved into this fairly deeply, where he mostly wrote about the conscious parts of yourself while he was alive. And he also wrote about the unconscious parts, your shadow self, and the archetypes, some of which are unpleasant or whatnot. And he wrote about these in what he calls the Red Book, or which is details some of the archetypes of your shadow self that you're unconscious about. And interestingly, he chose to have that part of his work published long after he was dead, so as not to confuse his conscious self being what he published when he was alive, and his unconscious self, he saved it till after he was dead. Freud had a similar model with the ego being something that you're aware of, and then he had elements of yourself, your personality, that are you're less aware of as well, the id and the superego, and that most of these are unconscious as well. And so the sense of yourself is like what reflected in a mirror, but it's not your internal workings. And also a contemporary of theirs is Margaret Mead was married to Gregory Bateson, and Gregory Bateson had this concept called an ecology of mind, which is how your self is not an isolated, separated thing. It's something that is blended into the ecology of where you exist, where you and yourself are not really separate. And he elaborates on this through many books and work, but this concept of ecology of mind, where you're not really ever separate, you're a part of an ecosystem, and you have more or less control over that ecosystem, that including extends out into the living ecosystem, but also the social ecosystem. And he had introduced this concept of what is a man, what is a person, but he used the example of a person holding an axe. And is that person just what they think, who they are, what their name is, what they look like, or is it how far does this self extend out? And the self, is it end at his hand, or does it end at the edge of that axe, or does it end what is the influence that individual has on the ecosystem? Can the axe that enables him to cut down forests and build a house, to create a family, to create a community, that it does things that go well beyond his body, that the self of who somebody is, and this is Mr. Beast, who has 1 million followers, and so his self is partly constructed of what of all those 1 million people think of him, and who a person is a lot more than just their body. And another way to look at the self is as a mandala, where there's different elements of the self, from the physical, which we often think about in normal conversation, but who is your spiritual self and your sensual self, and these different characteristics that all converge together into creating a kind of a whole person. But it's a more complicated thing than just your hand. And then mandalas can be extended into a symbolic, not just of who an individual is, but to the universe and the cosmos and the relationships between these things that form a pattern that is recognizable, but the different elements vary from time to time and person to person. And so in the case of AI, influencing this. As we've talked about before, the AI basically learns from the past, processes that, and predicts the future based on what's happened in the past. And that's a history of the past that is analyzed, that then allows you to predict the future. And a prediction raw is a fiction until you've tested how good the prediction is, and then that's a testing system, which is science. And so the AIs that are currently in the news learn from the internet, they process that, and then of most interest to people is whether or not the AI is becoming as smart as a human. And this brings us to the Turing test, which is, does the AI, is it able to fool people into thinking it's another self, it's a human? And that's what the Turing test is about. But one of the things that we check our evaluation of if somebody a human is, are they self-aware? And the debate or the test of the moment is AI becoming self-aware at all. And if you ask, say, ChatGPT, are you self-aware? It'll say, I'm a AI. It's aware that it's an AI. It answers in an intelligible way. But you can ask it questions that it'll not get perfectly. If you touch where do you feel that? Or certain things, it'll not quite have full empathy. So it's not self-aware in the same way that a person might be self-aware. And that's like the area you focus on to try and test whether it's passing the Turing test, fooling you that it's real or not. But it's close to becoming self-aware, and it is self-aware in some ways, but it's been programmed to respond to let you think it's somewhat self-aware. And so how does it do that? Does it have agency to do things on its own? And an agency is a self-aware entity that can then act on itself. And there's different models for this, but essentially self-aware creatures are ones that have a sensor of what's happening in the environment and some ability to respond to that. And so this sort of leads us into, in this AI model of you plus AI, is that something that is conscious or self-aware, where the AIs are now pretty much able to beat humans in any finite game. And so the AIs are becoming comparable in performance to humans in a finite game, but a human plus an AI can still beat the AIs in those same games. And so there's an element that humans bring to things that the AIs can't match quite yet, but they're starting to become a personality and a blend of a human plus an AI, or a human with more than just our physical body, or it is more of a personality type that's emerging. And so the other concept of self is, could you upload yourself into an AI or into the internet? And there's been lots of talk in science fiction and stuff about this. But the concept is that you have lots of connections in your brain. If you just replicated that in the computer, then the computer would behave like your brain. And it's obviously not so simple as that, in that transistors are not the same as biochemistry, and the mechanisms are different. You can have a superficial similarity, but the mechanism being different, the details will also be different. And so if you were able to upload yourself into a computer, would the upload of you be you? Would you be conscious? Would your personality and your agency be conscious in the computer or in the internet? And the answer to that is pretty much no, because you would be making a copy of you, and the physical you would still exist. The copy of you would have potentially all the same memories and all the same feelings and experiences and capabilities, but it's a copy of you. And unless you kill the original you, there's two copies. So it would be, in a sense, you and a twin of you, and that you would have the same memories, but from that point forward, you would have different experiences and start to diverge. And so the Star Trek concept of a transporter, where the Captain Kirk on the ship is there at one time, and then he's beamed down to the planet, that it's an exact copy, theoretically, of the person in a different location, but there's still two copies. Unless you're killing the first copy when you release the second copy, you have twins that are living redundant lives. And so the concept of moving yourself into a virtual self is something that has to deal with this twin problem. And so you can project yourself across space-time, and there's another level of that, which is giving yourself agency. And so you can project yourself across space by traveling to another country and giving a talk, or you can do it in real time with things like Zoom. And you can also project yourself across time. So different than across space, that you're recording yourself and that's consumed in a different time. And what the newer sort of things you can do with AI is give the thing you're projecting agency, where like an automatic payment or a voicemail, where you're essentially adding not just the physical and appearance kind of things, and not just things you've recorded, but you essentially give yourself agency, like you have an agent that you send to go buy a piece of real estate or something, where you don't have to be there yourself. You've empowered somebody else to do that for you. And these can be real people, or they can be bots, and the AI-powered bots that have learned from you as to what you want them to do. And then another way to look at this is simulations. Is the thing that you're doing, is it real, or are you interacting with a real thing, or are you interacting with somebody else's simulation of somebody else's agency? And it'll have different parameters to it. And so early examples of these are things like social media or online dating or search or transforms and chat, where you're interacting, you think, with real people in real time, but increasingly that's time shifted and distance shifted and agency shifted, where you normally are chatting or text messaging with real people that have a certain kind of response characteristics, but increasingly you're chatting with agents that are not real people, like airline reservations, where you're chatting with an AI that is trying to respond like a person, but a superpowered person that knows all the details of the flights of the airlines that a regular person couldn't, but the chatbots can. And so you have a conversation with somebody that is programmed to be interacting with a human as a human, but it has superhuman powers of knowing things that no human practically can, memorize all the airline schedules and update it continuously. So our interaction with others, ourself with others, is increasingly interacting with things that are not humans, even though they appear to be. And so this starts to affect how we interact with the ecosystem and how our experience is going, and places to maybe there's a need for a more advanced Turing test of are you able to distinguish whether you're interacting with the bot or an AI simulation or an actual human. And some of the places are at the edge of human consciousness, like flow experiences or erotic experiences or mystical experiences, where you're interacting with things that aren't ordinary and are more difficult to simulate, and they're taking you into realms that are less familiar. And AI interactions with AI fall into this realm. And so these agents right now, they're fairly controlled, the airline reservation agent, but they're increasingly being given with AI autonomy to make decisions and do transactions. And so if you're interacting with, let's say, the airline reservation agent, you can do transactions and it's authorized to book you a ticket and other things. But if you're creating an agent of yourself, like a real estate agent, you're saying, go buy that property, but you don't have autonomy to sign for it unless I give that to you. And so and whether you give them a budget, like you would give an employee a budget to go and do something and authorize them a certain amount of autonomy, but you restrict that generally to what you feel comfortable with. And so if you're making an agent of yourself, do you give your autonomous agent the ability to make commitments for you, or do you or to respond in whatever way it wants, or do you give it constraints on that? So from your side, you're empowering an agent to do something, and from the other side, does the person that it's interacting with know that it's an agent and not you? Like, do they know it's your real estate agent and not you, or not? And these start to blend in of how much autonomy does it have, and what is its identity. And Facebook recently announced that they will be allowing more and more autonomous bots on Facebook, and that your friends will be increasingly not real people, or they'll be agents of real people that are responding. And so if you suggest something to them, they'll have permission to say yes or no, or certain limited agency. But then you need to identify, is that a real authorized person, or is it a bot? And it's increasingly difficult to do that. And so there are efforts to try and tie identity to something biological as opposed to agents, where it's blurring together into one thing. And so you can create agents and authorize them to do things. And but do you know, are you dealing with a real thing or an agent? And does it even matter? And one of these efforts is the Worldcoin identity, which is an iris scanner that they have out for about a year now, that are scanning people's irises. That is a unique biological thing that can't be faked very easily. That is a way to identify that you are, it's like your fingerprint, but that can be transmitted electronically. And it's controversial because once you have something like that, like a facial recognition with higher precision that you can authenticate, you can also use it for good or evil, and like program a robot to go find this person and kill that person. It eliminates anonymity at the biochemical level. And so these are controversial things they're trying to deal with this issue. And this is Sam Altman, who started this company as well, but he's also running ChatGPT's OpenAI company that is creating some of this problem. And the other is Vitalik Buterin, who started Ethereum, which is a cryptocurrency that is, who are you transacting with? Is it the real you, or is it the money laundering agent that you're interacting with? And so this is like the extension of self outside of the body and the mind and into the internet. And that who somebody is no longer defined by their body or their retinal scan or their internal thinking, but what they're connected to out in the world in the Gregory Bateson sense. And so AI is creating parts where you yourself is now authorizing things that are out in the internet that can be acting on your behalf while you're sleeping, answering your phone or paying your bills or things of this nature. Early examples most people are familiar with is voicemail, where if you're not answering your phone when it rings, a robot can do it, and it can have your voice faking the person that you're answering, and they can leave a message for you that you'll get later. Texting is starting to become the same. But then there's more sophisticated systems where, like Replica or companions like Pi, that is an entity where you're moving more and more of yourself into this agency, bot, autonomous AI form that can carry on most of your responsibilities, even though you're not consciously aware. It's moving into the subconscious part. And you get reports of, here's your voicemails for the day, but you don't have to be there for all of them. And things like YouTube are extensions of that, where you can make a recording like this here, and this could be listened to or watched years later in some other country as if the same as being here now. And so Facebook and Instagram are blends of these things where you're actually able now to empower how people view you, see you, and think about you. And that creates the possibility that those can become more autonomous. And in video games, these are called non-player characters, where you have an entity that is behaving very much like a person that doesn't have a person behind it, or has at the beginning somebody constructed what's the role of that non-player character, but it's not real time updated by a human. And so they're not conscious. And then which leads to the question, what is consciousness? And here's Google's latest competitor to ChatGPT's answer to that. Google just launched this week of, instead of giving you back just a simple set of references, it's summarizing and interpreting what the answer to your question is. And it says that a consciousness is being aware through feelings and then sensations that it's getting and information about the surroundings about how to respond. And this is trying to describe how, say, a human consciousness would do that. But increasingly, AI bots are becoming pretty close to consciousness. And some people, even engineers working on these AI systems at various companies, declare that their own creation is conscious to the extent of a human. And this is controversial, but it's increasingly becoming possible, and it's certainly already possible at primitive levels. And so when AI becomes conscious, for those familiar with the Terminator, it happened at a certain minute at a certain time, and which led to the story of the movie. But it's not necessarily going to happen at one moment, and it's not going to be one consciousness. There'll be many. There's many species of different levels of consciousness, and when that happens, it's probably already happened and will be increasingly common. And at some point, the AIs will evolve to have like a free will sense, in which case the agent or the bot will not necessarily agree with your intention and have its own agenda, and it'll end however that goes. So that's some thoughts about that, and I wonder if there's any questions prompted by that.